Jan Baalsrud, alone on a frozen plateau in northern Norway, pulled out his pocket knife and cut off his 9 gangrenous toes, one joint at a time. He used cod liver oil ointment as a crude anesthetic. The work took 3 days. When he finished, he laid the severed toes on a rock ledge. He had bought himself more time, but Jan Baalsrud's journey to that frozen plateau began weeks earlier, in March 1943, on the Arctic coast of Norway. On March 29, 1943, a 75-foot Norwegian fishing boat named Brattholm slipped into a remote fjord on the Arctic coast of northern Norway. She carried 12 men, 8 crew and 4 sabotage agents, along with 8 tons of explosives and 3 radio transmitters. Their mission was to organize resistance and destroy the German air base at Bardufoss. But within hours, a single frightened shopkeeper would betray them to the Gestapo, setting in motion a disaster that would leave all but one man dead. The shopkeeper, who had recently taken over the store on the island of Ribbensoy, panicked after the agents revealed they had come from England. Fearing they were German provocateurs, he telephoned a Norwegian Nazi official. That call reached the German garrison in Tromsø, and by dawn a German warship was steaming into Toftefjord. Brattholm's lookout spotted the enemy vessel just 200 yards away and shouted the alarm. Sigurd Eskeland, the expedition leader, ordered the crew to abandon ship and lit a 5-minute fuse on the explosives. Jan Baalsrud and another agent poured petrol on cipher books and set them ablaze. As the German ship opened fire, the fuse burned down, but only the primer detonated, blowing off the hatch covers and wrecking the wheelhouse. A moment later, the full cargo exploded, destroying the Brattholm in a mushroom of smoke and debris. The blast threw the men in the dinghy into the water, but all of them reached the shore, where Per Blindheim was shot dead and the others were captured by the German patrol. Jan Baalsrud, a 26-year-old sabotage agent from Oslo, found himself swimming for shore as bullets churned the water around him. His friend Per Blindheim reached the beach beside him, but was shot in the head and fell dead at the water's edge. Jan climbed a rocky bank and drew his automatic, only to find the mechanism frozen solid with ice. He ejected the jammed cartridges, cocked the pistol, and when the Gestapo officer leading the pursuit came within 3 paces, he fired twice, killing the officer and wounding the soldier behind him. The remaining patrol fled for cover, and Jan began the long climb up a steep snow gully. The German warship turned its guns on him, and 3-pounder shells exploded in the snow all around, but he reached the crest and disappeared over the ridge. His only injury was a bullet that had taken half his big toe. He was alone in naval uniform, on a small island crawling with German soldiers. Jan scrambled across Ribbensoy, leaving false trails, and finally swam to a tiny rocky islet called Vargesund. He watched the Germans fumble their search through the dusk, using torches and firing at shadows. After dark, he swam another 220 yards to the island of Hersoy, where 2 children found him frozen and exhausted on the beach. Their mothers, Fru Pedersen and Fru Idrupsen, took him in, dried his clothes, bandaged his toe, and fed him. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. The women knew that German patrols would search every house by morning, so early on March 30th, the eldest son rowed Jan across the Sound to the island of Ringvassøy. He was put ashore near the house of a midwife named Fru Jensen, whose husband owned a motorboat that could take him to the mainland. But Jensen was away in Tromsø, and Fru Jensen could not leave her laboring patient. Jan decided to move on rather than risk bringing soldiers to a house with a woman in childbirth. Fru Jensen gave him a good breakfast, a bundle of food, and the names of trustworthy people along his route. She warned him about one Nazi sympathizer living up the valley. He set off on foot, wearing one borrowed sea boot and one of his own. The mismatched footwear, soon filling with snow that day, marked the beginning of a 4-day nightmare across the trackless interior of Ringvassøy. The map showed gently rounded hills, but the reality was a maze of steep ridges ending in cliffs, deep snow that sucked at his feet, and sudden blizzards that erased all landmarks. Jan pushed himself to march for 24 hours straight, then 13, then 28, covering only a few miles each day, his wounded toe grinding painfully in the soft rubber boot. Baalsrud finally staggered out of the trackless interior of Ringvassøy on the 3rd of April. He had been walking for 4 days with nothing but a bundle of food and the names of contacts, his wounded toe grinding inside a mismatched sea boot. The hamlet of Bjorneskar lay below him, a cluster of houses at the southern tip of the island, and he knew he had to reach the telephone exchange. The man who ran it was Einar Sorensen, and Baalsrud hoped he could arrange a crossing to the mainland. Einar Sorensen had just returned from Tromsø, and the news he brought was devastating. The 10 captured men from the Brathholm had been executed, 8 shot chained together, 2 tortured to death in a hospital. The expedition was annihilated, and Baalsrud was the only survivor that night. Einar's father, a 72-year-old fisherman named Bernhard Sorensen, agreed to row him across the Sound. The old man laughed at the danger, saying, "We'll swindle the devils out of 1 corpse." In a howling storm with German searchlights sweeping the water, Bernhard Sorensen pulled the oars for 10 miles and put Baalsrud ashore on the mainland. Baalsrud stumbled up from the beach to the nearest farm, a place called Snarby, and let himself into the kitchen. The farmer, Lockertson, was suspicious. A man in naval uniform with a wild story and a missing toe seemed more like a German deserter than a fugitive patriot. They argued for an hour before Baalsrud collapsed from exhaustion on the hearthrug. Lockertson paced the kitchen all night, searching the sleeping man's pockets, but found nothing to confirm his story. By morning, he had decided to help, and he offered to take Baalsrud part of the way in his motorboat. Lockertson dropped Baalsrud at the mouth of Kjosen, a finger of water leading into the fjord country. The road ahead ran through the village of Lyngseidet, where a German garrison was quartered. Baalsrud put on a pair of skis Lockertson had given him and pushed off at dawn. He passed a platoon of sleepy soldiers crossing the road for breakfast. They barely glanced at him, but at a roadblock in the center of the village, a guard challenged him, and rifle shots cracked behind him as he veered into a garden and scrambled up the mountainside. He was faster on skis than any German, and he left them struggling far below. Above Lyngseidet, the sun rose over the great fjord, and Baalsrud could see his route spreading out before him, the plateau, the frontier, freedom. But the weather turned without warning. A blizzard swept down from the peaks, blinding him with driven snow, and he lost all sense of direction. He climbed blindly, trying to find a way out of the mountains, but the wind shifted and eddied, and every step took him deeper into the wilderness. He was lost, alone, and the cold was beginning to claim his hands and feet. He climbed a steep snow slope, hoping it would lead to a ridge, but the snow slab fractured under his weight. The avalanche carried him down 300 feet, tumbling him over and over, burying him in a mass of ice. He came to his senses partially buried, his skis shattered, his food gone, and his eyes scorched by the glare so that he could barely see. For 4 days he wandered aimlessly through the white silence, falling again and again, dreaming of his dead companions, until he collapsed at the door of a cabin in the hamlet of Furuflaten. He had no strength left to knock. On the 8th of April, a farmer named Marius Gronvold heard a commotion from his sister's house in the hamlet of Furuflaten. He pushed through the door and found a creature that barely looked human sprawled on the floor, a man caked in ice and frozen blood, his eyes screwed shut with snow blindness, his feet encased in blocks of solid ice. Marius and his 3 sisters carried him to a bed, cut away his boots with a knife, and began rubbing his frozen limbs with snow. When they saw the brass buttons of a Norwegian naval jacket under the crust of ice, Marius sent the women out and demanded the truth, and Jan Baalsrud, barely conscious, whispered his story. Marius made a solemn promise: "If you live, I will live, and if they kill you, I will have died to protect you." 4 nights later, on the 12th of April, Marius and 3 trusted men lifted Jan onto a homemade stretcher and moved him through the darkness of Furuflaten. The only safe route lay along the frozen riverbed, directly beneath the windows of the schoolhouse where a German platoon was billeted. They crept past the building in the shadow of its own bank, then crossed the road while the sentry was at the far end of his beat. A boat was waiting on the shore, and they rowed Jan across the fjord to the uninhabited eastern side, where an abandoned log cabin still stood in a clearing at a place called Revdal. Inside that tiny hut, they laid him on a wooden bunk built of rough-hewn planks worn smooth by decades of use, hard and unforgiving, but after weeks of snow and rock, it felt like mercy. On the 15th of April, Marius returned to the Revdal hut with food and bottles of milk. Jan was still alive, and for the first time since the avalanche, he could see again. He had been amusing himself by pulling the moss from between the logs of the wall and rolling it in newspaper to make cigarettes, and he grinned when Marius swore he would bring real tobacco next time. Marius cooked fish over a paraffin stove and told Jan about the plan forming on the other side of the fjord. that men from the valley of Mandal were ready to help him cross the plateau to Sweden. Jan listened and nodded, content to rest, believing that time and solitude would heal him. But the storm came, and Marius could not cross the fjord for a week. Inside the hut, Jan's feet began to change. The toes turned black and swollen, and a foul fluid oozed from them. The pain grew until he could not sleep, and he lay in the dark counting the hours until Marius might come. When Marius finally pushed open the door on the 22nd of April, the stench of decay hit him before he could see. Jan's face was white as a corpse. The blankets were dark with blood, and the wounds were oozing. Marius washed the feet and bound them again, and both men knew without speaking that Jan would never walk or ski to Sweden. Marius promised to either find a doctor or arrange for Jan to be carried across the mountains, but he rode home that dawn with a heavy heart, knowing he had promised something he did not yet know how to deliver. On the 25th of April, Marius Gronvold and 4 men assembled at the Reverendol hut. They carried the sledge, the one the caretaker had built inside the German headquarters, and a 60-foot rope canvas sleeping bag, blankets, and a bottle of brandy. They lifted Jan Baalsrud, lashed him to the sledge, and turned it toward the mountain. The sky held a pale afterglow, and the temperature stood at 15 degrees of frost. The first obstacle was the forest of stunted birch that covered the lower slope. Beneath the snow lay a tangled mat of fallen logs, and the men had to haul the sledge in short, brutal stages, belaying the rope around tree trunks to keep it from sliding backward. The sledge pitched and yawed, and Jan, strapped helplessly on his back, hung head down on the steepest drifts. After 3 hours, they cleared the tree line and paused to rest. Jan barely conscious, the men sucking ice to wet their throats. Above the forest, a sheer rock face loomed, but a narrow cleft, the frozen bed of a stream, offered a route upward. The men edged the sledge across a steep snow slope, the outer runner canting over a 200-foot drop, and entered the cleft. They climbed in 60-foot stages, the leaders hacking steps with ski sticks, the lower men pushing. Halfway up, the sledge broke free and shot backward. Amandus Lillevol, braced below, took the impact in his chest. The sledge ran over him and stopped. He managed to hold it, though his ribs were likely broken. They hauled on, reached a frozen waterfall, and cut steps up the ice. When they broke through the cornice at the top, they stood on the edge of the plateau. The time was nearly dawn. They skied inland across the wind-scoured snow to a shallow dip that led toward the watershed. The place where the Mandal men were supposed to meet them, the foot of a steep bluff, lay empty. No tracks, no figures, no sign that anyone had ever been there. They searched the surrounding hollows and shouted into the silence, but only the wind answered. After a hurried discussion, they knew they could not stay. They had to be home before daylight or their absence would be discovered. They found a boulder where the wind had scooped a hollow in the snow, a hole exactly the size of a grave. They lowered Jan, sledge and all, into the hollow, untied the lashings, and left him what food they had. Marius promised to send a message to Mandal that night and to make sure the men would come. Then, one by one, they said goodbye. Amandus was the last. He asked if Jan needed anything else. Jan managed a grin and said, "No thanks. I've got everything, except hot and cold water." They turned away and skied home, certain they had left him to die. In Mandal, Herr Nordness had assembled his volunteers, but on that same evening a German patrol boat landed 6 soldiers and an NCO at the Mandal jetty. The Germans began a house-to-house check, sealing the valley for 3 nights no one could move. When a messenger finally slipped through on skis, Marius learned that the Mandal men had searched the rendezvous twice and found nothing. Jan had vanished under the fresh snow. The storm that had buried him had also hidden him from his rescuers. A week passed. Marius could not rest. On the evening of the 27th, he decided to go up himself, alone if he had to. A woman named Agnetha Lanes, sister of Olaf Lanes, one of the men who had helped carry Jan to Revdal, heard what he meant to do. She told him flatly that she was coming with him. She was as good on skis as any man, and she understood why he had to go. Marius agreed, and the 2 of them crossed the fjord in a small boat under driving snow, leaving Amandus to keep the boat on the far shore. They climbed a different route, faster and steeper, and reached the plateau rim in a full blizzard. The wind tore at their clothes and filled the air with stinging ice. Marius led head down, and Agnetha followed in his tracks, her face numbed, her breath short. They found the bluff, but the boulder where Jan had been laid was nearly buried. Marius dropped to his knees and dug with his hands. When he had scraped away 3 feet of snow, the rest collapsed into a cavity. He saw Jan's face below him, covered with rime, eyes shut. "Don't look," he said to Agnetha. "He's dead." At the sound of his voice, Jan stirred. "I'm not dead, damn you," he said. Then he opened his eyes and grinned. "You can't kill an old fox." They fed him and gave him brandy, and Marius marked the spot with a flag made from a rag tied to a ski stick. For 3 more weeks, the Mandel men kept Jan alive on the plateau, making one abortive attempt toward Sweden that was turned back by a blizzard. Jan's strength continued to fade, and the gangrene in his toes spread. The pain became constant and excruciating. He knew he had to act or die. Jan Baalsrud lay alone in the snow hollow on the plateau, staring at the gray sky. His 9 toes were black with gangrene, and the pain had grown so intense that he could no longer think clearly. He knew that if he did nothing, the infection would spread through his body and kill him. He took out his pocket knife. He began to cut, one joint at a time, using cod liver oil ointment as a crude anesthetic. The work took 3 days, and he had to stop often to overcome the nausea and dizziness. When he finished, he laid the severed toes on a rock ledge beside him. The stumps still hurt, but the poison had stopped spreading. He had bought himself a little more time. After the surgery, the Mandel men returned and found Jan still alive. They carried him down from the plateau on the sledge and installed him in a cave in the Mandel Valley. They laid a bed of birch branches and grass on the floor, and when they pushed him inside, he felt warmth for the first time in weeks. He slept deeply for 4 days, waking only to eat the food they brought him. His clothes dried out, and the constant chill that had gripped his body finally loosened. On the 5th day, the Mandel men carried him back up to the plateau to meet a Finnish Lapp who had promised to take him to Sweden. The Lapp appeared on the plateau without warning, a small figure in a dark blue tunic embroidered with red and yellow. He wore reindeer skin boots with turned-up toes and carried 2 knives at his belt. He stood motionless for hours, studying Jan with narrow, slanting eyes, saying nothing. Then the Lapp vanished and returned with his reindeer herd, hundreds of animals milling across the snow. He lifted Jan onto a larger sledge and covered him with blankets and skins until only his eyes showed. The herd moved. The sledge jerked forward, and they began to race across the plateau toward the frozen lake called Kilpisjärvi. German patrols spotted them from the hills. Rifle shots cracked overhead, and the herd stampeded, hooves pounding the ice. The sledge swayed and bounced as the reindeer ran. Jan could see the far shore of the lake, Swedish territory, growing closer with every stride. The herd crossed the lake in a cloud of snow spray. The shooting faded behind them. The sledge slid onto the Swedish shore, and the Lapp slowed the deer to a walk. Jan Baalsrud had reached neutral ground after 55 days of flight, 55 days since the fight in Toftafjord. A Swedish Red Cross seaplane landed on a stretch of open river and flew Jan to a hospital. The surgeons examined his feet and decided to try to save them rather than amputate. After 3 months of treatment, both feet healed. He returned to England and learned that every single Norwegian who had helped him, Marius, Agnetha, Bernhard Sorensen, the Mandel men, the Lapp, the fisherman, the midwife, had escaped German reprisals and survived the war. But those who had sailed with him were not so fortunate. Per Blindheim, his close friend, was killed on the beach at Toftafjord. Sigurd Eskelund, the expedition leader, was among the 10 captured and executed by the Gestapo in Tromsø. Jan Baalsrud survived because ordinary people in a conquered country chose to risk everything for a stranger. Farmers, fishermen, school teachers, and a wandering Lapp herd owner, none of them knew his name when they first helped him, but they all understood what it meant to defy an occupying army. Their courage remains the quiet answer to the question the war asked of every Norwegian. If you have stories of courage from your own family history during the war years, we would be grateful if you shared them in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel and click like to support more documentaries like this one. Thank you for listening.